Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we'll get started. This is Nicole Mace. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont School Boards Association. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's free webinar on emerging issues in negotiations. First Thursday of every month, the VSBA offers a free webinar on topics of interest to our members. If you registered for the webinar but aren't attending live, you'll receive a video copy of the presentation, and please follow up with any questions that you have after viewing. So I'm going to, if I can get my computer to cooperate. I've already introduced myself. Carrie, you want to say hi to folks?
Hello, everyone.
Carrie Lamb is our Director of Operations. Sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
No, I was just going to say, this is Carrie. I'm glad to be here tonight.
If you have any trouble whatsoever during the webinar, that's the contact information to reach Carrie, and she'll sort whatever challenges you're having out, as she does for all of us on a daily basis. I'll go through a few logistics for the webinar. You'll see at various points tonight, we're going to pause to take questions. If you have a question before we've officially made it the question time, please feel free to jump in. We have a pretty small crowd online tonight, so your comments and questions are always welcome throughout the presentation. You should see a question box on the side of your panel. That's the best way to type your questions in. Carrie's keeping an eye on those, and she'll let me know when someone has a question. At the end of the webinar, you'll receive a link to an evaluation. Please take a couple minutes to complete that so we can get your feedback on the content of tonight's webinar. And then in the next, probably early next week, you should receive an email with a follow-up that includes some summary information. To the extent folks had questions that we couldn't answer or get to tonight, you'll have answers to those questions, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and the video, the link to the video archive, which is going to be kept on our YouTube channel, as well as the VSBA website. So tonight we're going to cover a few emerging issues. Probably the biggest development in recent years is statewide bargaining for health insurance. So I will give you a brief update on the process and where things stand as of today. Go through sort of the effects that that process may have on local bargaining dynamics. And then I have a few slides on salary schedules and some other contract changes that may be on your horizon. Maybe some of you on tonight's webinar have worked hard over the last few years to make some changes to your contracts. If that's the case, we'd love to hear from you. We'll wrap up with a case study if we have time, and of course we'll take your questions and do our best to answer them at any point in the presentation. So let's get started with statewide bargaining for health insurance. So Act 11 last year created the Public Employee Health Benefits Commission. And that commission has 5 members that were appointed by the VSBA and 4 members appointed by the NEA and 1 by AFSCME, which is a union that represents some school districts' bargaining units for support staff. And the law is very clear about the makeup of the commission. This past fall, the VSBA members approved a process for the VSBA to appoint membership. And the VSBA board did so in December. The names of the commissioners are South Burlington School Board Chair Elizabeth Fitzgerald. She is serving as the chair for the employer commissioners, along with school board members Susan Prescott from Lamoille North, Patrick Healy from Twinfield School District, Adrian Raymond from Mill River, and Ed Karen from Springfield School District. So they are your commissioners who have been hard at work since January, preparing for and engaging in negotiations. The law requires all school employees to move toward the same health insurance benefit. It does not require that to happen overnight. It may happen over the course of 2 bargaining cycles. And the duration of the agreement is, as you're accustomed to at the local level, is a subject of negotiation, but the law specifies that it cannot be shorter than 2 years. The law establishes a process that I will go through on the next slide that could end with binding arbitration, which is different from the process at the local level, and it eliminates health insurance from local bargaining. So this is the timeline that we are in the thick of at the moment, or at least the commission is in the thick of. I'm not involved in the day-to-day and negotiations at the table, but the law required the parties to begin bargaining by April 1st and to agree to a fact finder or mediator by April 5th. Those deadlines were met. The law gives the parties between April and August to come to agreement, so it's a pretty tight timeline for these negotiations. If they have not come to an agreement by August 1st, then they have to move to fact-finding. And there's the statute lays out some hard and fast deadlines in terms of when the parties must meet with the fact-finder and when the fact-finder's report is due. If after receipt of the fact finder's report, the party still cannot come to agreement within 30 days, then they proceed to arbitration. And the model of arbitration is last best offer. So the arbitrator must pick one party's entire proposal, cannot sort of pick and choose between the two. The deadline for that process is a hearing by mid-November and a decision by mid-December. If, however, there is an agreement before arbitration, at any point in time, the parties can come to an agreement before the arbitrator issues a decision. The arbitrator's decision is final, but if the parties can agree to something, which is, I think, everyone's preferred outcome, then the law requires a process for ratification. It required the VSBA to establish a process, each side really, establish their own process for ratification. The process that was approved by the members last fall requires each SU and SD in the state to appoint a voting delegate. We believe most of you have done that so far. Kara, do you know, and I should have asked you this ahead of time, sorry to put you on the spot. Do you happen to know how we're doing in terms of voting delegate information?
Let me check on that. I'll get it back to you when you have your next question break.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. But you can, if you have a question about whether or not your board has appointed a voting delegate or sent it our way, you can certainly send Carrie an email and she'll get you that information. Those voting delegates will vote on a final agreement, and they will do so by electronic means, and the VSBA will set up a process for doing so securely, and we'll also, our process requires us to put on an informational webinar within 10 days of the parties reaching agreement, so that we can move to a vote in an expedited fashion, because the timelines are fairly tight. So the current status, the parties are negotiating on schedule. There was a dispute, and there continues to be a dispute between the parties over the use of alternates. So the Vermont NEA, for the first couple of meetings, and as ground rules were being discussed, insisted that they be able to bring 5 alternates to the table, effectively doubling their team, contrary to the language of the statute. So our side proceeded with the understanding that the law controls unless both sides agree to do something differently. And so that dispute ended with, well, resulted in negotiations being called off for one session. And at this point, the parties are discussing, well, our side did file an unfair labor practice with the labor board in order to get clarification on the issue of alternates. The labor board declined to take jurisdiction of that question, and so now the only option is to go to an arbitrator. There's not an agreement over which arbitrator to use. So the current status is that alternates are not in the room during negotiations, but they are available to the NEA team when they caucus. And so with that understanding in place, negotiations have been able to proceed on schedule, which is a good thing. Because there's not an agreement on ground rules at the moment, negotiations appear to be somewhat open in terms of information that is being shared. The Vermont NEA established a website where they are keeping track of proposals and providing updates on the latest status of the talks. So if you have questions for your bargaining representatives about where things stand at a particular moment, or you want to weigh in terms of your input as more information comes out about as proposals continue to be exchanged, the email address to contact those commissioners is on the website. The VSBA does not control the commissioners. We don't provide them with direction. They are their own entity at this point. We provide them with support, and they have their own legal counsel, who is Joe McNeil. So I am not the person to go to if you have questions about the process. Joe McNeil wrote a newsletter article for our upcoming, our summer edition of the VSBA newsletter. So definitely look to that if you want some more details. And the last thing I'll say is that impasse proceedings, so that we don't run into a problem with, gosh, we can't schedule mediator or fact finder. Those proceedings have been scheduled in advance. So to the extent we need to seek mediation, that will be held on August 1st. The fact finding meeting with the fact finder is scheduled for August 12th. And if necessary, arbitration is scheduled for sometime in October. So that is where things stand right now. As you'll see in the information from Joe, the parties are pretty far apart on conversations around cost sharing of out-of-pocket costs and how to address support staff. I think that's probably the biggest challenge this group faces is licensed teachers and administrators tend to be within, relatively close proximity in terms of the benefit levels, premium share, et cetera, who's covered, who's eligible, support staff, and what tiers of coverage are available. Support staff are more all over the map. And it was certainly one of the goals of the law was to bring greater equity in terms of the benefits available to school employees. But that is difficult to do in the context of support staff, where some districts offer support staff access to a single plan only, while others offer all 4 tiers, single, 2-person, parent, child, and family to support staff. So, keeping in mind that one of the goals of the law change was to realize some opportunities to bend the cost curve related to healthcare expenses for school employees. Balancing those two interests, I think, will prove to be a challenge. I'll close this section with just a little bit of a discussion about the impact on local bargaining. So if we assume the process will move through and conclude with arbitration at some point in November or December, that should conclude with enough time for you to negotiate the remainder of your collective bargaining agreement with employee representatives, which is scheduled to take effect the following July. I think it's important that both employers and employees, if you have a labor management team that already meets regularly, or just representatives from the bargaining teams, take some time to learn together about what's in the healthcare agreement and what its impacts are on employees and employers. It's important to have a shared understanding of the benefits in order, both for two reasons. One, employee education, and for the purposes of bargaining. So if one side believes that employees are fundamentally worse off for whatever reason with respect to healthcare employees, and the other side believes that, has a different view, that's going to be difficult to navigate as you bargain. So before you sort of get into the swing of negotiations, it may be useful to hear from your own some outside party. Hopefully the VSBA will be available, and somebody from the NEA will be available to work together to convey information about the benefits, so that bargaining teams at the local level really understand what's what and know how to proceed. Of course, the final agreement, although it will be the same in every district, will affect every district differently. So it's also important that you understand the fiscal impacts. So what does the new health benefit mean in terms of the costs to your district? Are you better off? Are you worse off? It's likely that there will be some districts for whom this is financially, it could be that it's financially better in terms of the overall costs. And in other cases, if your support staff benefits in particular are substantially lower than others in the state, then that may lead to increased costs. So definitely make sure that you have a clear understanding of the fiscal impacts, and then based on those, understand what that's likely to lead to in terms of the dynamics at the bargaining table. So will the union be coming to the table seeking to be made whole for some, either some employee group? Is the board going to need to find money in order to pay for increased costs, or will they be under pressure to do that? So really be spending some time in the late fall, November, December, unpacking what this statewide benefit means, and so that you can plan your bargaining strategy accordingly. Okay, we're at break time for questions, if anybody has any.
We don't have any questions at this time, Nicole, but I did want to let you know that we have received 36 healthcare delegates.
And we have about 55 SUSDs, I think, at this point.
That's correct.
Okay, so we're still missing quite a few. Make sure to check back with your superintendent or board chair and see whether or not the delegate has been appointed and communicated to the VSBA. This is your last chance to ask any questions. Good.
We have one. How common?
Fantastic.
Yes, it says, how common is it for boards' attorneys to attend negotiations?
So that's a more general question about negotiations. I think that differs greatly, and it's differed year to year. I will say when I go to national conferences and go to collective bargaining workshops, it is a very foreign concept that you would not have negotiations entirely conducted by an attorney, and in some cases not even have the board or a board committee present for the negotiations. So that I think is the standard in the rest of the country. In Vermont, it's really all over the map. Some boards have their attorney function as the lead negotiator. Others have an attorney advise throughout the process, but perhaps not attend every session. And still others don't use an attorney really at all. My advice is to rely on the advice of counsel and include your attorneys to the greatest extent possible in the process, because that can help you avoid issues down the road. Particularly as like healthcare has gotten more complicated, and a lot of other employment law issues have gotten more complicated, and so having expertise I think can really help save money and time in the long run.
Okay, that's the only question that we have at this time, Nicole.
All right, well, we'll keep moving. We're going to move away from healthcare bargaining and to some other emerging issues at the bargaining table, and we're gonna start with this chart that is bound to make your eyes glaze over. So this, for those of you who are relatively new to negotiations, I've never served on a negotiations committee. This may be fairly foreign to you, but this is something we've been talking about in our trainings at the VSBA for several years now, and that is index salary schedules, which were negotiated into contracts back in the 70s, back when Vermont teachers had the lowest salaries in the nation. Even we were 51st in the nation, including Washington, D.C. And so the index salary schedules were really designed to lead to increases in teacher salaries within relatively short periods of time. And they do so by including a multiplier within the index. So I'm going to orient you to what you're looking at. The first column over here, Carrie, can you see my cursor moving? I can't tell. But the column labeled BA is yes, I stands for bachelor's. Yeah, okay. So these are your where most incoming new teachers without a master's degree will start on the salary schedule. So if you want to imagine your first year teacher fresh out of undergrad starting in your district, they would be column 1, which is the BA column, and step 1. So in this particular district, and this is a fictional district, so just a sample we're using, the starting salary for first year teachers is $35,000. If you've taken, let me back up, many school districts in their collective bargaining agreements with employees have professional development credits that they will pay for employees to further their professional learning and growth. And so in the next column, BA plus 15, demonstrates an employee that has a bachelor's degree and 15 credits of post bachelor's degree coursework. And so you can, in some instances, have an employee that came in at step 1 in column 1 and is with the district for 1 year, but during that year took 15 credits of coursework. That employee would, rather than move from step 1 to step 2, would move from step 1 to step 2 and from column 1 to column 2. So the salary increase for that employee would move from you'd see from $35,000 to $38,500. So the third column is our employees that have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree plus 30 credits of coursework. And then for the purposes of space, I cut out the fourth column and included the fifth column here, which is a master's degree plus 15 credits or a bachelor's degree plus 60. And so depending upon the negotiated schedule, most teachers moving along the salary schedule would receive at a minimum an automatic annual pay increase of about 4 to 5% simply by coming back to teach the following year. So moving from step 2 to step 3, I think I did this earlier, it's about a 5% increase in salary. And you can see when we talk about the index, so a lot of the discussions at the negotiation table talk about increases to the base. The base amount is the amount that has the index at 1. And every step moving forward or moving up within that column has a multiplier effect of the onto the base. And then if you move over a column, the column starts at with the index at a higher level. So the more experience you have and the more coursework you have, and depending on the year in which that occurs, you can see individual employees can see pretty substantial salary increases. So I'm going to move now to, so this is assuming year 1 of a, we'll say a 2-year agreement. And I'll draw your attention to a teacher that has a bachelor's degree that's been in the district for 3 years. So in the first year of this agreement, her annual salary would be $38,500. So here in year 2 of the agreement, which includes just a 1% increase on the base. So if you'll see last year the base was $35,000. This year it's $35,350. So if the agreement says over 2 years we're going to increase the base by 1% per year, that same teacher would now be in her 4th year of service and be earning a salary of $40,653, which is about a 5.5% raise in a single year. If that teacher also earned 15 additional credits, however, she would move to step 4 of this column and earn $42,420, which is a 10% raise in a single year. And again, remember that school districts often cover the costs associated with coursework that leads to advancement on the schedule. And for a school district to, on an annual basis, and again, it'll depend on the salary schedule and the movement within a district. But for the average school district to cover just the step increases, so no increase to the base, but everyone in your employee, licensed teachers in this case, covered by this agreement, to just come back to work the following year, you're looking at an average cost increase of about 2%. So one of the issues that we see with salary schedules now is that, number one, it's very difficult to communicate and understand the cost effects to community members and what an increase in the base means in terms of employee compensation. So if the message to the community is, we settled an agreement and it's 1% new money over 3 years, so Community members, I think, believe that, that's fairly in line with, or maybe even a little conservative compared to their own experience with employers in terms of an annual increase. But the phenomenon of the index and moving steps and columns, that's translating into 5 to 10% annual increases in salaries, that's much less understood. It's not very well understood among school board members, and it's certainly not well understood among community members. And so we have been making recommendations for several years now for school boards to start talking with their unions about the need to move away from the index. And there's several reasons to do so. One is, I cut off the last, I think it's 7 or so steps on the high, teachers who have the most experience and the most professional learning. But the original salary schedule that I had the teachers that are at the top end of the index salary schedule making double what first year teachers are making. And while I think people agree that experience and expertise should be reflected in salaries, being compensated twice as much as a teacher who's responsible for, in many instances, the same, similar if not the same job, that's problematic. And we know we're having difficulty retaining new teachers in districts, and particularly certain districts. So one benefit to moving away from the index is to free up some resources to increase salaries for newer teachers and to sort of even out the disparity and the differential between newer teachers and teachers that have been in the district for a long time. Moving away from the index and the multiplier helps increase transparency for taxpayers and employees, for that matter. I think many employees don't understand the schedule, haven't seen the schedule, don't quite. So, if the headlines during a difficult bargaining process are the board wants to give you only a 1% increase when cost of living is going up 2 or 3%. If employees themselves don't understand how the index works, they may not understand, well, actually, I stand to see a 5% increase based on just coming back to work here next year. So I think it can help sort of eliminate the shroud of confusion around employee compensation in school districts. It can offer other methods to reward teacher tenure and effectiveness. So, really the driving factors in the index are how many years have you been in the district and how much coursework have you done? And those are really the only 2 opportunities to increase compensation. And I think while someone might, intuitively believe that more education means greater teacher quality, there's very little reliable research to support that. And there's been studies by the National Council on Teacher Quality that concluded advanced degrees had little, if any, impact on student achievement. So I think it's important to really question some of the assumptions that were built in to the system that was created in the 1970s that was really designed to rapidly increase teacher salaries, which were very needed at the time. We have different needs for our school system now. And so I think if resources are a concern in your district and leveraging dollars to attract and retain high quality teachers is a priority, then you should be looking at the index. There are many districts that have started to do that. They've taken slightly different approaches. Some have eliminated the multipliers, so just basically eliminated this entire column and moved toward negotiating sort of flat amounts. So we can bargain dollar amounts for certain steps, which can help reduce the gap between the high steps and the base steps. Or you can, I think the first step when you're looking at your index is to ask your business manager or HR director to really plot out where are folks right now on the salary schedule. It may be that you can collapse some steps. So if, for example, you don't have any first or second year teachers in your district, or very few, you could consider collapsing the first 2 steps and bringing everybody up to, have basically step 3 be step 1. So you're automatically increasing the base salary amount fairly substantially by collapsing, by moving anybody who is in steps 1 and 2 to step 3 and making that the new step 1. So there are a lot of different options, and so we definitely encourage you to initiate that conversation and consult with either your attorney or someone who has a lot of experience doing this work when you're thinking through what approach you might take. It's going to definitely key off of where people are at in your schedule and what your priorities are in terms of, do we need to free up resources, whether it's to pay for increased healthcare costs coming our way because of the statewide agreement. Do we want to move away from coursework-based, advancements on the schedule because we want our professional development dollars to be more targeted toward district-level initiatives? There's a lot to unpack in the index, and it's definitely, I think, important and necessary work in order to start to free up and target resources differently, while at the same time ensuring that we're able to provide new teachers with compensation that's going to make them want to stick with the profession.
Nicole, we have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
This board member wants to know, she said, I don't know if I should interrupt. So in this set of schedules that you are looking at, is there a 5% increase each step and also a 5% increase for moving over a column, plus the percentage increase in the base that you mentioned?
I would have to, I think it's going to depend on what step you're moving from and what column, but the multiplier is a 5-point multiplier. So I don't have my calculator with me, but I think that's roughly what I talked about, right? So if you're moving from step 3 to step 4, it's a 5% increase, and then if you're moving over to the next column, it's roughly 10%. I think that's right. So another option is to, in terms of addressing the salary schedule or making changes to the salary schedule, is to change the multipliers so that it's not necessarily a 5% up and a 5% over. Are there any other questions on that topic?
I don't see any at this time.
Okay. And I'll just say, this is not an easy task, and it's not likely something that you will be able to raise at the negotiations table for the first time and make substantial changes, unless your district's facing some kind of substantial financial crisis or pressure. So, the way negotiations work is you make a little bit of incremental progress over time. And so now's the time to at least initiate that conversation. But I would manage expectations in terms of the changes you'll be able to make it within a single bargaining cycle. It may be, however, that the new healthcare benefit for some districts puts a degree of financial pressure that creates an opening for thinking differently about the index. So just keep that in mind. I think the other area I always like to call attention to in the context of bargaining is the fact that the profession has evolved substantially. And as I just noted earlier, collective bargaining tends to be an incremental process in terms of changes, little tweaks being made over time. But in many instances, the agreements that were negotiated in the 60s and 70s are the bones of which we still have today. That's not a universal truth. There are some agreements that that do look pretty different, but by and large, we have collective bargaining agreements in place that don't really reflect the changing nature of our world and society, but also education. You know, teaching is increasingly characterized by greater variability in methods, scheduling, location of learning. Teachers are being called upon to move away from working in isolation to working as part of a team. And so it's really critical that our collective bargaining agreements facilitate this transition and transformation of the teaching profession. So we think that that means that agreements ought to reflect greater flexibility in teacher availability to students, obviously within reason. Greater flexibility in method, scheduling, location, and differentiated pathways into and within the profession. And I think that the discussions around the salary schedule can help with that. So if you have somebody who's got 20 years of experience as an engineer and suddenly decides, you know what, I would like to go get my teaching license through the teacher apprenticeship program or whatever, and become a science teacher, physics teacher, whatever, in a high school, how are your contracts and salary schedules? Are they flexible enough to allow someone with that level of background and expertise to make that kind of career change and have it make economic sense and be fair, frankly. So, and we know that there are definitely areas in the state where we have a shortage in terms of teachers with specific qualifications. Special educators are in high demand and increasingly difficult. Speech language pathologist, etc. So really think, you know, board members should be asking their administrators whether there may be opportunities through collective bargaining to reflect the direction that we're headed in education, which is to be more student-centered and to move to being really flexible, responsive systems that may not necessarily be governed by a schedule that starts at 7:30 and ends at 3:30 and has very clear start and end times. So with that in mind, I do have a quick case study that normally it's nice for you to be able to chat with your fellow board members around, but given the limitations of the webinar, I'd just offer you a minute to read this and reflect on it. And then I have a couple questions for you that I'm hoping you'll respond to in the question box. So I'll give you about 30 seconds to just read this through. So I just want to say, not every contract dictates the start and end of the day. Some districts do have contracts that have more flexibility, offer more flexibility to administrators. But substantial changes like the one being contemplated here, well, rather than tell you what I think, I'll ask you, do you think that this approach, that the board will be successful getting the proposal into the new collective bargaining agreement? If not, what do you think the board or superintendent could do differently? And then I'll add a third question. Have you done something like this in your own district, maybe either through the collective bargaining agreement or some other mechanism if the agreement allows for flexibility in start and end times? It's always risky to do a case study when I can't see who's who's there.
No responses yet, Nicole.
No responses yet, huh? I'm gonna wait one. And we can't tell if people are typing, can we?
No, we can't tell if they're typing.
Yeah, like
we can tell if they're
they're
attentive or not. We can tell if they're like on a different page, but we can't tell if they're typing.
I'll just give another few seconds.
Oh, there we go. I work in central office of a district and we recently expanded the day, but I don't know how we built that time in.
Okay, and can I ask a follow-up question? Did you expanded the day for teachers and students?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that again, if you're not sure whether that had to come into the agreement or not, I can't really offer a reflection.
She said, but all have the same hours of the day.
Okay, so they don't have the staggered schedule. They just went from, a 7-hour day to a 7.5-hour day, or 7 hours and 15 minutes. I would imagine that type of change would have been made through the collective bargaining agreement. And often it comes at a cost to the district. If it's like, well, we'll give you either it's days, so we'll move from 180 work days to 185 work days, but that's going to come, at a cost to the district. This proposal is really suggesting that employees would work the same amount of time, but do it on a different schedule. And I would say that if you have a collective bargaining agreement that dictates start and end times, no matter how innovative, or even if you have clear past practices where, and most districts do, where school starts at this time and it ends at that time, and employees are free to go as soon as the student day is over. They're expected to stay for 25 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, after the student day is over. You're not going to be successful in changing longstanding practice, whether it's enshrined in a collective bargaining agreement or not, if the first time you have that conversation is at the bargaining table. So if a district is committed to becoming more flexible, innovative, responsive to concerns of families and or students themselves. I mean, we know that there's a lot of research on teenagers who, that getting them to school, asking them to be at school ready to learn at 7:30 is fundamentally doesn't work in terms of their biological rhythms. So there's lots of good reasons. It's better for families to have a school day that's more aligned with the work day. There's a reason we still have the same school day hours that we've had for for as long as any of us can remember, as long as any of us have been in school. And that's because it's really, really hard to make these changes. And so you would be wise, if you're thinking and moving, exploring different directions, that it be part of a greater conversation district-wide around what are the needs of children and families, what are the needs of the students in our high school, or how can we make it easier for students to participate in internships or other extended learning opportunities outside of the building. Start to build a vision and some momentum in the community around, identifying what some barriers to changes like that would be, and then developing some solutions and doing that with your employees at the table. You'll be far more successful having conversations around, well, how do we make some changes to the collective bargaining agreement to reflect the commitments that we've reached together as a community, both within the school and outside of the school, then you will be the board and superintendent have a great idea and it makes a lot of sense, and on paper the numbers work, and we can't understand why we're not being successful at the bargaining table. Well, and I think you could apply that. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Nicole, I was just going to say, so I think you have been backed up by one of the board members who says, I believe that changes like this are always hard. There would need to be community support for this type of proposal that would be a multi-session discussion.
Right.
And we have another board member that said, I think more prep time may have been added. I don't think staggering would go over well. I don't know why too different.
Right. Well, and that's, I think a lot of things, we're all on the same page. Our systems and really families are sort of organized now around this seemingly immovable calendar and schedule. And, that if it becomes a priority for the district, but I would say, and I think I was just going to say this, you could apply that lesson to any change you'd like to make within your school, whether or not you need to bargain it in the agreement or not. That any type of change really needs to reflect the shared vision and commitments that the community has, and that employees share, so that employees know, if I'm coming to work in this district, we're going to be, pushing the envelope in a lot of different ways, and I want to be part of this district because that's the kind of work environment I want. I don't think folks should shy away from that. And that may not be a good fit for every employee. But I think if you create a culture in your schools of we're going to try new things, we're going to always be focused on what's best for students, and we're going to sort of question structures and assumptions that worked well in their time but need to be updated in order to meet today's needs. I think that's an important mindset to bring to all the work you do. And in particular in the collective bargaining arena, because it can be so difficult to make changes. It's really wasn't designed to create a lot of opportunity for change. Any more questions or comments? We're pretty much nearing the end of our time together this evening.
I'm not seeing any right now, Nicole.
Okay. Well, you know how to find us. If you do have questions, here's our contact information. Happy to either email or talk over the phone about your own experience, or if you're feeling like, gosh, this webinar got into areas that I'm not even ready to start talking about because I don't feel like I have a handle on the basics. We've got some resources for you there, and I'm happy to talk with you about any questions you have that didn't get covered tonight. So thank you for participating tonight. Just another reminder to complete the online evaluation, and we'll see you next month.